Good morning. My name is Jerry Dooley. I am a school counselor at Taylor County Middle School and a PhD candidate at Waynesburg University in counselor education supervision. Born and bred Appalachia. So what we're going to look at today is more of a restoration process as far as the West Virginia incarceration setting is in the state. And I have, of course, the slides to share, but we're not necessarily going to just go over those slides verbatim. They'll be uploaded. You can be able to see whenever and however you choose. But they do offer kind of a roadmap of what we're going to be doing. As far as the next 10 minutes or so is concerned, we're going to focus on the different, as far as West Virginia, Appalachia is concerned, the difference between the state and the federal prison system. Most of my numbers are from the state system. I've tried to include some federal system numbers as well, but most of it is from the state's perspective. We're going to emphasize as far as what we can do as advocates for good time credits that allow education to be a part of that. And we'll talk a little bit about good time credits and also the intentionality. I believe that over the course of the recent history anyway in prison reform, there's been an intentionality to move from okay, let's give those who are incarcerated some education, what have you. And I think early on, even though the intentions were good, I think it was more of how do we keep the prison population from rioting, from fighting, so let's keep them busy. But I think over the last recent history, there's been more intentionality of let's really invest in those who are incarcerated. So when they come back into the general population of community, they are not seen by their past. They're not seen by what they've done or the reasons they went to prison, but they are now seen truly as being restored to the greater community because they have an education, because they have sacrificed. Even in the incarceration system, the inmates have really worked to better themselves. And as a result, I think we are obligated as a society to say, you're still part of us and we want you to succeed. So that's kind of where this whole towards restoration is moving towards. It is predominantly focusing on the good time education credits and our role as advocates. West Virginia is the only state that is completely, entirely engulfed in the Appalachian range of 420 counties. So it is rather unique, I do believe. Some of these early slides we're going to bust through because, like I said, it's just little prison stuff of how many prisons and where they're at and all that. And you can see that when you download the presentation. Of course, in March 23rd, 1869, we ratified as a state the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But early on, our state placed an emphasis on education for white or population. But in 1866, we begin to see a movement among our state, not as a state, not as a government, but within the society to push for publicly financed schools for people of color. And West Virginia ranked one of the first in the South to begin to do so. But let's look at numbers. There is inequity when you look at the numbers with people of color being incarcerated as to Caucasians. I think an important defining line when we look at the prison system is that the census counts inmate population as state residents. Whether they are located in a prison, a jail, state, federal. If you have someone coming from Kansas into one of our federal prisons, the census does consider that now a population number statistic for the state of West Virginia. But regardless where the inmate is or where they are sentenced from, and they are in our numbers, we have an obligation as a state, as a community, whatever state you may be in, we have an obligation as a community to seek the restoration of those who have, had a checkered past. And let's be honest, who has not had issues? They may not be legal issues, but how many of us have not had issues? None. So we have an obligation to work to bring these back into society as brothers and sisters and a part of who we all are. The grand total, you're looking at about 14, almost 15,000 in state of West Virginia prisons, jails, and detention centers. And then you've got several that, if you want to look at federal institutions in the state, I have listed those. There are the links when you download, if you download the PowerPoint, links to look more at different correctional facilities in the state, because I really want to spend our time on advocacy and education as a way of moving forward the restoration process. When you take into account our population of incarcerated individuals, 93% of the state's population is Caucasian and makes up about 80% of the incarceration population. But it's interesting as you look, the people of color from, and I'm going to focus mainly on the very last one, the African American. We have 4% state population, but 17% incarceration population. It doesn't matter if they are from Appalachia or from West Virginia or they've been sent from another state. The bottom line is they're a part of our community. They are important. And so part of our advocacy to bring back restoration is to begin to fade away some of those dividing lines. Regardless of what they've done, they quote unquote paying a debt to society, they're us. They're a part of what makes us who we are. And we have to see them as equals and loved, regardless of the color of their skin. But with African Americans and other people of color, they're part of us, and we want to embrace them when they come out. How do we restore them to society by saying, you're a part of who we are. We are not complete without you. So I think President Gee at WVU has, wanted to diversify. It's all white board. So we begin to see, even in our state, at government and educational levels, a desire to seek more diversity within leadership. And it does give us some perceptions within our state. So where do we start for restoration? Again, 16% of the state population has less than a high school education. But when you look at the incarcerated population, 25.8 have less than high school graduation. So you begin to see that the state numbers of the general population and the incarcerated population is extremely lopsided in terms of education. So then our focal point with an incarcerated population is educational attainment. How do we invest in bringing educational opportunities into the incarcerated population, realizing that there is inequity, there is way more per capita or whatever as far as the population is concerned with people of color and how many are in our population of incarceration facilities. So, of course, the WVDE, Department of Education in West Virginia, they do invest in programming. 12 12 prisons, 10 regional jails throughout the state. They do, focus on some kind of education and career plan, but is that enough? Is what the state does enough? I would dare say no. And what we need to do is to seize our roles, whether you're a counselor educator, whether you are, whatever your, I guess I say counselor educator because that's the perspective I'm coming from. Whatever your discipline is, we have to move into this role of advocacy, because what is happening, what is being offered, simply not good enough. Now, this is more of one school that has a history in religious education, but I'm not focusing on that. But one example of its success in West Virginia, and really across a lot of the Appalachian region, the 420 some county or 420 counties, is a place called Ashland University and their correctional education program. Just a mile from where I work in Taylor County is Prunytown Correctional Facility. And Ashland University has a working program that the state has allowed them to come in and begin to advocate, work, and educate those that are incarcerated. Now, again, there are other examples. I just picked one that I was kind of familiar with because of the proximity to where I work. But let's get to the good time credits. An honest reform of education is this good time credits. You do get days off. You get time off, days off of your sentence by having good behavior. I think one place for us to advocate for reform is to make education attainment, or even if it's incrementally, as a part of the good time credit. If somebody in our incarceration setting, such as, whatever the race may be, but if somebody in our incarceration setting is working at earning an education so that when they come out, they are becoming active members, productive members of society, then we need to advocate for education as a part of that good time credit, not just good behavior, because they're investing in themselves. They're doing what we, are encouraging them to do. I think we need to advocate for Pell Grants. Nothing happens without money. It doesn't. So we have to advocate for securing specific Pell Grants or funding for targeted education, not only for the entire incarceration system, but for those that are that show the inequity, like people of color. We need to invest in that. I do believe that one thing that schools can do, such as Ohio University, Western Carolina University, Appalachian State University, what have you, is can we have more targeted internships at the master's level or even at the doctoral level in correctional counseling, to where they go in and they begin to work with those who are currently incarcerated. In West Virginia, we have Marshall University, we have West Virginia University that have wonderful programs. Can we become more targeted in the way that we use correctional counseling or any of our counseling internships in targeted populations? This is the reform, I believe, and I guess I could be wrong, but as I look at the research, this is where we need to go. It's not about just throwing in the money. It is about empowering the incarcerated population to attain an education, and that we in the community, for all that we have, not just finances, right into that. So when they come out, they are part of our community and they know it. Not only are we expressing it, but they feel it, because we've invested more than money. We've invested time, passion, love, grace. Legislation. Okay. Like I said, all of this is going to be in the system, but the good time credits, the advocacy for that, advocacy for the money will make us restorative rather than punitive, because we want people to be whole. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, we'll be around at the end. Thank you, Ohio University, for hosting the virtual conference.
Okay, so let me just just a clarification. Ohio University's, we're going to host physically in 2023, and this has been hosted by the steering committee of ASA. We work together, but I am at OU. I appreciate the shout out. Yeah, great.
Thank you, ASA.
All right, so we do have time for one live question. If anybody has one, you just need to raise your hand and I'll call on you. Otherwise, questions and comments, the chat is open. Okay, feel free to continue or to continue to post comments in the chat. And Jerry, just keep an eye on the chat in case someone wants to, has a comment that you can respond to, okay?
Yes, ma'am. And I hope my camera was on because I just see that it was off.
It was on. Well, we saw you in the beginning. It was fine. Your presentation was fine. Thank you so much for kicking us off this morning. Okay, our next presenter is Lisa Orr. Are you ready to roll, Lisa?
I am.
Feel free to start sharing your screen, and don't forget to do a short self-introduction.
I sure will. I'm just opening my file. Just give me 1 second here. It's a big file. I like pictures.
Jerry, just want to make a note that there is a question in the chat, and you can respond right in the chat to Elena.
There we go.
That looks good.
Okay, great. So, hello, my name is Lisa Orr. I'm an associate professor of landscape architecture. I'm also the program coordinator there at West Virginia University for landscape architecture. I study cemeteries in Appalachia, and in particular, I've been working in the New River Gorge. And today I'd like to talk to you about some work I've been doing. This is really a work in progress in the New River Gorge. I've been focusing in on 2 small areas called Claremont and Stone Cliff, and exploring hidden and segregated cemeteries in the New River Gorge in that area. And just to orient you, the New River Gorge is, of course, in the southeastern part of West Virginia, in the circle there. It's part of the New River coal field. You can see it in orange, circled there in red. And these are all of the Appalachian coal fields from Pennsylvania down through Tennessee. This is the New River Gorge National Park and Preserve. This just happened, of course. The New River Gorge used to be a national river run by the National Park Service, and at the end of last year, it became a national park, our newest national park, which is very exciting. And so this is a protected area. It's been protected since 1978, which makes it an especially interesting place to study. And it's about 72,000 acres, and it's about 55 miles of the New River. This is an ancient river carved through sandstone, creating an average of about 1,000 feet of vertical change. And I'll show you some cross sections. You can see here in the hillshade how steep this gorge really is. But here are some cross sections showing you how deep this gorge is. They call it the Grand Canyon of the East. So just to show you quickly the landform, how difficult and rugged the terrain is for building any sort of settlement in this area. But this is, of course, what it looks like today. And the New River Gorge Bridge is quite famous on its own. And it's famous, the New River Gorge is famous for recreation. This is what we know it for whitewater rafting, for rock climbing, for kayaking, and just for natural beauty in general. But many years ago, from about 1880 to 1950, the New River Gorge was full of people. There were about 50 coal company towns, and many people lived in the gorge for coal mining operations. And so these little red dots represent all of the little towns that were scattered throughout the New River Gorge. Here are a couple other maps that show all the little towns that were scattered along the basin of the river. There was very little land for these towns to inhabit. And this is the area that I will focus in on, Stonecliff and Claremont, right along the river there. You can see there's a sort of, there's a bench right along the river that's relatively flat, and that's where the buildings for the towns were placed. Basically, they were placed wherever they could be placed. And so here's some historic photos I just wanted to show you of some other towns. You can zoom in here if you can see. I know they're tiny, but you can see the little tiny houses and the little company store there on the left-hand side. Basically, they put buildings in small towns wherever they possibly could in the New River. And they put them wherever they could, and they put them right along the river, right along the railroad tracks. That's what I was trying to say. Whoops. So my research questions were, because I study cemeteries and cultural landscapes, who was buried in the New River Gorge? Where were they buried? Why were they buried there? We know that mining is an intrinsically dangerous occupation. We know that with many, many people living in the New River Gorge, that people were clearly dying there as well as living there. The population was growing by leaps and bounds from 1880 to 1950. And so I became very interested in knowing where these people were located and where they were buried. And in 2007, there was an archaeological study that was done, and they identified some burial areas. And so I wanted to pick up on that research and do a little bit more digging and try and find some more information about some burial areas in Stonecliff and Claremont. And my methods for doing so were to look at demographics, to look at historic topographic maps, the C&O Railroad valuation maps, historic photographs. I did my own field work, stomping through the forests in the fields, and then ended up doing some genealogy to sort of end up where I am today. So the number of mine workers in West Virginia grew exponentially over from 1880 through 1950. The C&O Railway came through in 1873. There weren't enough native West Virginians to do the work. There were only about 26,000 native West Virginians in the area at the time. By 1900, there were 60,000 people living in the New River Gorge, and the coal company towns, they recruited people from southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Southern Blacks, as well as white Americans from older coal regions in the United States. They recruited these people to come to the New River and do this mining because there simply weren't enough people to do the work. And so in 1907, this is what the breakdown looked like. About 24% of the people working in the mines were Black in Fayette County, which is the area that I'm focused on, and 40% were white Americans, and then the rest were immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that is similar to what was happening in West Virginia. There were slightly more African Americans in Fayette County than in the rest of West Virginia. And this is true in 1912, the numbers just continued to grow. And in 1917, the same, the numbers just continue to grow with 27% African Americans in the mines and 20% in West Virginia as a whole. So let's focus in here on Stonecliff and Claremont. You can see where we are. And looking at these historic maps, I was looking for things like these little cemetery boxes or little crosses on historic maps, looking from 1891 all the way through to 2016. And the truth is I didn't find any. I couldn't find any cemeteries or grave markers at all on USGS maps, which was unusual. But I did find lots of little towns, lots of schools and churches, little buildings and houses, but no cemeteries. And these are the C&O railway valuation maps. So this came from the railroad. These red dots show you, I can blow it up a little bit. I know it's real blurry, but just believe me that there's a school there for whites and a school there for blacks. But again, no cemeteries. And this is Claremont, the same deal. There's an area called Flat Creek that I became very interested in, and one grave. I found one grave on this map. And this is Stonecliff and Claremont, and you can see Flat Creek is the area that comes down in the middle here. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, probably not. But it's the area that comes down through the center there into the flat area in the center of the screen. This is Flat Creek. This is where Flat Creek enters the New River Gorge. And you can see it's sort of a flat area. This is what Stonecliff looked like back in the day. Railroad tracks right along the river, buildings right along the river on the right-hand side of the railroad tracks. This is what Stonecliff looks like today. I was there on a kind of gloomy day. It's actually a very beautiful place. The railroad is still operating today. And there are ruins of the existing, what was once a bustling town, foundations of previous buildings and coke ovens, you can see with trees growing out of them. And then there's this Flat Creek area that's circled here on the map as you're traveling south, and then you end up at Claremont. And this is the Flat Creek area here. And you can know that you're at Flat Creek because there's the railroad crossing signal and there are mature trees alongside the railroad tracks. And this is where I entered the woods. And I knew that this was the area because of the 2007 archaeological survey, as well as being pointed in the right direction by the National Park Service staff. So I entered the woods at this area and I started to mark where I found graves. And the little yellow triangles that you see on the map are GPS locations of graves, grave markers. And I found essentially two burial areas in this region, one northern and one southern, and they were basically, they're difficult to see. I'll show you photographs, but basically I knew I was in the right place because I found daffodils, fencing, large trees, yucca plants. I call them indicator species for cemeteries. So basically things that indicated that humans were actually in this forest at some point and were using this place as a cemetery previously. The grave markers themselves are very hard to read. Sometimes they're just these metal markers that are impossible to read. There's nothing left. Sometimes there were tombstones. Sometimes there are just these field stones in the ground, and you know that they're grave markers because they're in lines. They're lined up in rows, and they they're sort of organized in a logical way. And so you can see that they are actual graves. But some of them you can read, but very few. And some of the metal markers you can read as well. So I took an inventory of all of this information and wrote down all of the names and dates of all of the people that were buried there, and ended up doing some genealogical research. So I went on to Ancestry.com and was able to look up quite a few of the people that were buried in this area that had names that I could actually read on those metal markers. And what I was able to do was to confirm their race. And in this case, what I was able to figure out is that these graves were for African Americans. They were Black Americans, and they were not white. So the 2007 archaeological survey had indicated that there was a white cemetery and a Black cemetery, and my research shows that that is not at all the case. My research shows that they were actually both Black cemeteries at Flat Creek. And so I was able to just confirm that using genealogical research. So the Black headstones were confirmed Black at 32%, and the quote unquote white headstones were confirmed Black at 46%. And that leads me to my hypothesis at the end of this whole thing. To have a hypothesis at the end, I know is a bit weird, but my thought is that that white miners were probably often buried outside the gorge. There probably wasn't a lot of room for cemeteries in the New River Gorge. And I believe that my working hypothesis is that many of the white Americans were probably buried outside of the gorge, up above. And I need to do additional research in order to confirm that.
You have 1 minute.
Okay, great. I'm right at the end. So in conclusion, I think that I just want to say that, you know, as a national park, I believe that the New River Gorge National Park and Preserve has a responsibility to preserving and protecting these cultural resources, and that this kind of research that I'm doing is a way of beginning that conversation to sort of starting to begin to allocate resources to do that, so that everything doesn't just get buried by the rugged natural resources of the national park. So
Thank you, Lisa. We do have time for one live question. If not, there are a couple of questions in the chat. I can read one of those. Does anybody have a live question, want to raise their hand? Okay, so there is a couple of questions, and I'll just go with the first one here for you, Lisa. Zeta Kamara says, great study. I'm an archaeologist and am most familiar with cemetery survey done through disciplines of archaeology, architectural history, and historic preservation. Methodologically and theoretically, I'm really interested in what landscape architecture adds to the cemetery survey. Could you talk a bit about this?
Well, landscape architecture is obviously the study of the land. So I'm really interested in I was mostly interested in how these coal company towns were laid out. So I began to think about the streets, the gardens, the houses, the churches, the buildings, the layout of the entire area, and then how the cemetery was related to that. And so I expected to find some relationship across the entire sort of cultural landscape. But what I didn't find that. And I think it's because the New River Gorge is simply too rugged. But and I also think that landscape architecture, cultural landscapes, that it just I sort of take it for granted that cemeteries are cultural landscapes and that they deserve to be treated as such. So I sort of come from that. I look at it from that lens, from a landscape lens. In this case, this is difficult because there's so much that's hidden underneath brambles and brush. And we're certainly not digging. I'm not an archaeologist.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to stop you there. There are several questions though in the chat, Lisa. So once you stop sharing, if you want to pop over to the chat and respond to some of the questions, I think that'd be great.
Okay, so let's see. Stop presenting.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
And then you can turn your video off.
Okay.
All right, Ted, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, the floor is yours.
We will start with the first sound sample.
Okay, and
Thank you.
can you just tell me which one that is?
It's the Leola Manning one.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Satan is busy or the arcade building?
The arcade building, please. Thank you.
Okay, just give me a second to load it up here.
It was on one Thursday morning, March the 20th day. I think it was about 2 a.m. I believe I can firmly say the women and their children was screaming and crying. Not only that, they was slowly dying.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
No problem at all.
Okay, folks, thank you for being part of this presentation on the Knoxville sessions of 1929 and 1930 and what they revealed about African American music in Appalachia. I'm going to start. I'm Ted Olson with East Tennessee State University, and I'm a professor of Appalachian Studies at ETSU. And I'm going to start with a quote from one of the better known musicians to hail from the East Tennessee area, Howard Armstrong, an African American musician who was quite an amazing musician and artist and raconteur. And he said this about Knoxville in the 1920s. He called Knoxville, quote, about the most liberal town in the South towards Blacks, end quote. And that's a quote that needs to be taken into some context, and we'll return back to that quote at the end, but thought I'd let Howard Armstrong have the first word on Knoxville's role in presenting a place where musicians came to the table, came to the recording studio, as it were, and shared some of their musical traditions with the world through the medium of recorded sound. Well, there's a lot of backstory about what I'm doing in this presentation, and that backstory can be found in a book that accompanies a box set of recordings released by the Bear Family Records label. So I encourage anyone who wants the full story to look there and to listen there. That was a box set that I worked on with Tony Russell, a British researcher and scholar, very important individual in the kind of the research history of Appalachian and country music. And I worked with Tony on that project for a number of years. And what I'm going to share with you today then would be the findings of several years of research. I will suggest that the Knoxville sessions, that I'm calling them Knoxville sessions, are known by other scholars as the St. James sessions. The St. James sessions refers to the St. James Hotel, where the recording sessions that I'm referring to this morning took place. So historians, of course, they adopt terms to refer to things that are useful for the theories, the ideas they're trying to espouse. And I prefer the term, I suppose, Knoxville sessions. I mean, they happen to take place in a commercial hotel, but they really reveal a great deal about Knoxville as a community, and I prefer that term. And I think that's perhaps the more generally used term these days beyond the St. James sessions, but either one, of course, is accurate. There's so much to say about Knoxville and its role in East Tennessee. I mean, it was the capital of the Southwest Territory. It was temporarily, shortly, I should say, the capital of Tennessee. It's an important economic hub, and hub in every sense of the word for East Tennessee. And it's a city that has been misunderstood over the centuries. Howard Armstrong thought of it as a very kind of fertile place for African Americans to travel and make music. He played on the radio there, for example, for a number of years with his family band. Others, outsiders, you might say, came to the city of Knoxville. John Gunter famously called it the ugliest city in America in the 40s. So it's I think, a city that's been had a diverse and misunderstood history, but it's an important history. And so we're kind of celebrating it in essence, particularly celebrating its role in fostering traditions of African-American music. East Tennessee, of course, has produced a great deal of African-American music, and we don't want to give Knoxville all the credit for having kind of, born this music from community life. In fact, most of the musicians who recorded in Knoxville, as we'll see, were from other communities and navigated or gravitated to Knoxville to find work, to play their music, to preach in some cases, and to live. And so Knoxville gets the credit really that should be shared across the East Tennessee region. And just as a brief kind of setting the table here, the Knoxville sessions, as I'm calling them, and as I think they've become widely known, are commercial recording sessions. They're not fundamentally documentary recording sessions. And that's an interesting difference from, I think many people think of 1920s era recording, and they might, those perhaps less familiar with what happened then, might think that what happened in Knoxville was a documentary recording session in, along the lines of what Alan Lomax so famously did throughout the United States. Well, Lomax was recording primarily from a documentary perspective. He was a documentarian first and foremost. But what happened in Knoxville was the recording of music for commercial distribution. And that's an important point because it underscores why many of the African-American artists who recorded in Knoxville in 1929 and 1930 were not released. Their recordings were not released. They were deemed not saleable. And we don't have them today, some of them, to appreciate. We do have perhaps half of what was recorded by African-American artists from Knoxville in 1929 and 1930. And of course, we can listen to those, whether today or at some point you can hear them. Some of the folks we'll talk about in this short presentation, alas, we don't know what they sounded like because the recordings were scrapped. They were not released for various reasons. Well, in the interest of time, quickly to say that the Knoxville sessions were produced by a gentleman named Richard Voynow. He was a jazz musician based in Chicago. He was white. He had a strong affinity for African-American jazz. He was active in the early 20s in a group called the Wolverines, featuring Bix Beiderbecke, famous jazz musician, also white. So he was coming to Knoxville to record music and to commercially kind of sell it by means of his record affiliation, his recording company, the Brunswick Vocalion Company. Brunswick made pool tables, but they also produced the equipment and the records themselves for distribution of recorded sound. That, of course, was the era when 78 RPM records were selling quite, well, they say like hotcakes, but perhaps even more, popular than that in the 20s. The many genres of music boomed in the 20s, and moving forward, country music very famously originated during that decade. So Voynow was recording music of Appalachian musicians, whomever he could audition and get to record in his makeshift studio in the St. James Hotel in Knoxville, in downtown. And that site is commemorated by the city historical marker today. Many white musicians recorded what was then at the time known as hillbilly music there. But Voynow did manage to record, or at least audition, fully 16% of the musicians who came into the studio over 2 visits to Knoxville in 29 and 30 were African Americans. 16% marks a dramatic increase over the number of African Americans recorded in other Appalachian location recording sessions, which is the term used to refer to those commercial recording sessions. Voynow recorded a number of African American musicians. As I said, we heard Leola Manning just before I started singing the Arcade Building Moan. And in 1929, Wednesday, August 28th of that year, Leola Manning, who was a street gospel singer, very fine voice, as we heard, came into the makeshift studio. She was from originally Chattanooga, so that was her birthplace. She spent some time in Middlesboro, Kentucky, then moved to Knoxville, where she stayed the rest of her life and eventually married and raised a family. She recorded Arcade Building Moan, and that was in fact recorded in 1930, but she first recorded in 1929 2 gospel recreations of vaudeville songs. Interesting to note that she was a sincere Christian woman who got the message of her faith across by co-opting secular music and kind of reframing it to spread the gospel. After Leola Manning, on that same day, August 29th, 1929, Odessa Kanzler came into the studio from Loudon, Tennessee, but living in Knoxville at the time. And Odessa recorded some blues numbers that were not released, and there might have been a number of blues recordings. We're not quite sure. The documentation of those recording sessions is faltering at times. But that's just another example of voices that were not ultimately kind of released to the general public by reasons that are unknown to us today. It could have been a performative issue, it could have been a technological issue, but we don't know what she sounded like. We do know that she sang some, what might have been some sort of urban blues songs, and that's the extent of our knowledge of Odessa's repertoire. But also recording that same day in 1929, Eugene Ballinger on guitar and Willie Gase Haynes on piano. And Willie Gase Haynes was from Knoxville, but Eugene was from West Virginia. That gives a sense of which parts of Appalachia are represented in the Knoxville sessions. People coming from different places, choosing to either live temporarily or permanently in Knoxville because of that environment that Howard Armstrong described. Eugene and Willie recorded, accompanied Leola Manning on all her recordings throughout the Knoxville session. So you did hear Willie Gase Haynes's piano playing there just a little while ago. Howard Armstrong favorably compared him to Earl Father Hines, so he was of considerable talent. Alas, Willie Gase Haynes died very young, a couple of years after the Knoxville sessions, and these are his only recordings. Very quickly here to cover some of the other people that recorded. In the interest of time, I'll be brief. The Senior Chapel Quartet was basically it was a gospel quartet affiliated with a church called Seni Chapel in East Knoxville, which was an African American settlement area in Knoxville. When we wrote the book for the box set, the Knoxville Sessions, Tony Russell and I visited the contemporary manifestation of that church. The church has moved several times. It's now called Lenin Seni United Methodist Church. It's the largest Black church in the Holston Conference of the United Methodist Church. we wanted to see if that was in fact the church that produced the 4 recordings that are marvelous renditions of Black gospel quartet singing. And we were able to, I think, come away with that meeting with the church congregation that it likely had happened from that congregation's gospel quartet in 1929 in the 20s. Hard to prove, but we did have some oral testimonials to memories of a very fine set of singers there in 1929, 1930. So moving on to 1930, one has to acknowledge the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, who on April 3rd, 1930 recorded 2 numbers, Knox County Stomp and Vine Street Drag, that formed the front and back of a 78 release that has become quite legendary in old time and blues music annals. It's really African-American string band music, and it's beautiful, led by the great Howard Armstrong of Dayton, Tennessee, where he was born, raised in La Follette, Tennessee, and with his brothers. And in that particular trio, Tennessee Chocolate Drops, which was also known as the Tennessee Trio, by the way, and I'll explain that very soon. But also in that band, there also was Roland Armstrong, who played guitar, and Carl Martin, a great blues guitarist who in that trio played bass. Carl Martin, by the way, was from Big Stone Gap, Virginia. And there's a historical marker in Big Stone Gap commemorating Carl Martin, who went on to blues fame in Chicago in the 30s. The group, the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, of course, you could say inspired the Carolina Chocolate Drops in more recent years. Very inspirational connection there between those contemporary musicians and the original members of the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. The Tennessee
Ted, you only have
Drops.
about a minute. You only have about a minute.
I'll summarize very quickly here. Thank you for the warning. That record released for the Race Records market for African-American purchases. There was a perceived audience of African-American purchasers, and that 78 was issued as the Tennessee Chocolate Drops to that audience, the race audience as it was called at the time. And those same records were released to the white audience, the perceived white audience, because there was lots of back and forth borrowing across the races, the Tennessee Trio. So that explains why they had 2 nicknames. And then just very briefly, we won't play any more samples, but they can be heard in various places. The great Leola Manning returned to the Knoxville sessions, to the makeshift studio in St. James Hotel in downtown Knoxville, to record the Arcade Building Moan, Friday, April 4th, 1930. And that was based on an incident that had happened just 2 weeks before she recorded. She wrote that, and it was a topical ballad based on a true incident that she had heard about, and then other ballads as well. So just to summarize very briefly, these are perhaps the most visceral representations of African-American music making in the 1920s in Appalachia. And we're lucky that they happened, and we didn't get all the recordings, but the ones we got are masterpieces. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. We do have one more presentation, which is a pre-recorded presentation, and there might be a minute or 2 after this presentation is over, because I do not believe that the presenter is with us. Are you with us, Lee? So if there is time, because we have to wrap up at 10:15, I'll put that Tennessee Chocolate Drops audio up to close out the session, because it's a good one. If you have questions or comments for Ted, please use the chat, because I need to start the final presentation of the morning, which is the whiteness problem in America's prison system, from Laura Lee Morris from Furman University, and this is a pre-recorded session. So I'm going to begin that now.
Prison system. This is an early/partial draft of an essay I'm working on that explores the juxtaposition between incarcerated populations as disproportionately people of color and those who volunteer in prisons who are often white. This essay doesn't seek to fix anything, but I hope to begin a conversation. I don't delve deeply into Appalachian prisons in particular throughout this essay, but this is very much an Appalachian problem, as building federal prisons has often been used as a way to save the region as coal jobs have dwindled. For example, West Virginia has more federal prisons per capita than any other state. Robert C. Byrd's doing, as he worked to bring federal jobs to the state. And Kentucky has built 3 federal prisons over the past 30 years. Other examples abound. Here's the story I keep returning to. It was 2015, and I was teaching creative writing at a women's federal prison in Texas. It was 8 p.m., the end of the very last night of my children's writing class. One student and I remained in the education building, the rest having returned to their housing units. After 6 weeks of class, 6 hours per week, all 11 of my students had completed their final projects, writing, illustrating, and compiling a storybook for children. I had bound 11 books that night, 1 for each student, a task I'd never completed in all the times I'd previously taught the course. Usually, a few students came to the final class claiming they'd finish them later, but none ever did. On this night, the very last time I'd teach children's writing at the prison before moving to South Carolina, I was feeling quite proud of my students. And to be honest, I was feeling pretty proud of myself. Then my student said, "We're missing a pair of scissors." I stopped congratulating myself. The celebration was over. The missing scissors weren't a safety issue. They weren't sharp enough. Besides, if you wanted scissors, you could buy them at commissary. This was a minimum security prison where that sort of violence wasn't much of a concern. These were crafting scissors that would cut a pretty design into the edge of the paper, and with Easter and Mother's Day approaching, the scissors were a commodity. People would pay the owner to make cards they could send a family. And because you couldn't buy anything like them in prison, they were a luxury item. My student and I searched the supplies to make sure we hadn't placed them before turning to other areas of the classroom. We looked under desks, behind shelves, under stacks of paper, in the trash can, in the bathroom, even inside potted plants, everywhere we thought they might be. Finally, we had to admit it. The scissors were gone. When my supervisor arrived, she asked where the rest of my students were, but once they'd completed their books, I'd let them return to their housing units, seeing no reason to keep them. In my 3 years of teaching at the prison, no one had ever stolen more than a few extra sheets of paper. I trusted them. My supervisor sprang into action, ordering students back to the classroom, calling the lieutenant via walkie-talkie. Then she leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and stared at the women as they assembled. My students took in the atmosphere and sat quietly, eyeing one another and me. I shrank in my chair, shoulders slumped, and didn't meet anyone's gaze. Everyone assembled. The lieutenant walked into the room like some tattooed Texan Elvis, mutton chop sideburns, boot heels clicking on the floor, colorful tattooed arms that disappeared into the sleeves of a white undershirt that strained across broad shoulders and broader belly. Without glancing at my supervisor or me, he began to yell. He goose-stepped across the room, screaming about the hell he would put these women through if the scissors didn't turn up, as though prison weren't hell enough. The women sank into their seats and stared at the floor. When the lieutenant finished his tirade without a confession, he relegated my supervisor and me to the hallway. From there, we heard the rise and fall of his voice, no longer yelling, but speaking calmly. Days later, I learned he told these women they had 1 hour to produce the scissors. If they didn't, he'd choose 3 women from the class, 1 white, 1 Latinx, and 1 black, and put them in the hole until the scissors were found. A woman in her late 60s looked around the room, then at him, and said, "But I'm the only black woman here." "Then I guess you're going to the hole," he said. The story continues, though for the purposes of this presentation, I'll stop here. In a moment when a white woman and her white supervisor watched a white lieutenant divide the students across racial lines as a mode of punishment, and I didn't speak up. There were valid reasons not to. I didn't know about the racial punishment at the time. My role as artist in residence had nothing to do with discipline. If I were to speak up, the program could suffer, hurting more women in the long run. Whether you accept these excuses or not doesn't matter, because it never even occurred to me to speak up. I was wondering whether I'd be in trouble for not keeping track of my supplies. I was feeling hurt that someone had stolen from me. In short, I was too busy thinking about myself to consider the trauma the lieutenant had inflicted upon the students I'd come to know and respect over the previous 6 weeks. In case you're interested, someone did turn in the scissors, though no one ever discovered who stole them from my classroom. That no one was punished for the act makes me happy, because I eventually realized that the theft had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with my class, but had everything to do with larger problems within the system. I've shared this story before. Each time I delve into a different detail. One version concerns trust in prison communities. Another focuses on the risks and rewards of teaching in prison. A third illustrates the fact that if you do your job well, you have to simultaneously forget you're in prison and remember exactly where you are. Part of me feels bad for discussing this moment so very often. Sometimes I feel as though it overshadows other experiences I've had teaching in prison. But it's not that I don't tell those stories. It's that this one seems to illustrate so very many subjects that are key to examining the work I've done in the prison system over the past decade. Today, I'm focused on whiteness, the 2 officers' whiteness, my whiteness, and the blackness of the lone student who feared being punished because of her blackness. The racial and ethnic disparity in America's prison population are well known, but let me offer a few numbers from the NAACP. I could offer them from the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Prisons, but these ones are from the NAACP. So 32% of the U.S. population is Black or Hispanic, compared to 56% of the country's incarcerated population. This varies from state to state. Blacks are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. Black women are imprisoned twice as often as white women. If Blacks and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rate as whites, prison and jail populations would fall by almost 40%. Even sentencing has been shown to have a racial disparity, with African Americans sentenced to longer periods than whites. The deeper I dive into the research, the clearer the racial disparities are, and the longer I spend in prison education, the more I see its effects, both inside and outside of the prison. The Furman Prison Education Partnership student group meets on Friday afternoons to discuss mass incarceration. My co-director and I have implemented these weekly Zoom meetings during the pandemic because we're unable to hold classes in the local prison as we'd planned. Furman University, where I work, so Furman University students who are interested in the American justice system join us to learn more about a part of society with which they've had very little interaction. Furman is a private school, and many of our students come from backgrounds where prison is not a part of their daily lives. This academic year, we've instituted a speaker series to discuss mass incarceration with our small student group and with the larger university community. Most recently, 3 currently incarcerated men joined us to discuss the system from the inside. Over 20% of the university student body tuned in for this event. And afterward, we heard from students who wanted to get involved in our program, who wanted to learn more about incarceration, who had never talked to someone personally affected by the justice system. After the official event, we hosted a Zoom discussion with the 3 incarcerated men and the small student group we meet with weekly. The 10 student faces on my Zoom screen were young, earnest, and except for one, white. My co-director and I are also white. The 3 incarcerated men are all Black. Their teacher, who facilitated the call, is white. I felt like I should comment on this fact, point out that it supports our previous discussions about the racial disparity in the prison system. But I said nothing, unsure what to say beyond the obvious. The men shared so much of themselves with us, including some very personal details about their lives, how they grew up, when they were first incarcerated, what it means to be a Black man who spent most of his life locked up. One said he was determined to stay out of prison once he was released, but also confessed that he was afraid. He'd never had a real job, had never tried to stay out of prison before. Our life was foreign to him, a concept none of us had considered before. We were all educated that night, as we are every time we talk to someone who has dealt with the justice system firsthand. We can do the research and read the books, but there's so much we can't know. During another Zoom event with a previously incarcerated man, also Black, we asked about the claim from a prison employee that when a person is incarcerated, they have to fight it first to prove they're strong. He replied, "No offense to the person who said this, but he's never been on this side of the bars." And he's right. We cannot know the reality of incarceration without these conversations, without working with those who are affected firsthand. But here's the question that keeps returning. How am I supposed to think about the sea of whiteness I see in front of me each week? A sea of white to which my face only adds. On the one hand, we are the very people who need to learn about the system. On the other hand, where's the line between ally and white savior? This question rattles in my brain, makes me question the work I've been doing for the past decade, makes me question my own place in the system. When I first began writing this essay, I relied on my anecdotal experience that those who take part in volunteer opportunities in prison are often white. While attending yearly volunteer training at the Texas prison, I noticed that almost every face in the room was white. The advisory group for the Furman Prison Education Partnership is all white. When I attended training on teaching in prison a couple years ago, over 85% of the trainees were white. When I pass other volunteers at the prison in South Carolina, most of them are white. Yet when I began to research the racial background of prison volunteers, I found nothing. I reached out to a national prison education group that I'm part of and received 2 responses. One directed me to a new organization that may get this data together eventually. And another person let me know he's beginning some data collection on prison education programs through the State University of New York system. He did offer one bit of anecdotal evidence, that the incarcerated students have asked for more diversity amongst the professors who teach in the prison. But this is the extent of what I've been able to find thus far, that so many of us notice the whiteness of prison volunteers, but we don't have any data yet to support our personal experiences. Does the race and background of those who volunteer their time in prison matter? I think it does, but it doesn't mean we should stop doing the work because of our race. What I should do is be cognizant of my whiteness, and I should talk about my whiteness and that of my students. When I look at the moments I've shared in this essay, I see my own silence, and that silence makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to argue that I should always speak up. There are some valid reasons to keep quiet, but I should always ask the questions. Should I speak up? Why should I? Who does it affect if I speak, and who is affected if I remain silent? Asking these questions matters. Thinking about their consequences matters. One last story before I end today's presentation. At the state prison where I currently teach, my co-facilitator tried to make small talk with the incarcerated students before our very first class began. She commented on the pictures of dead white men that adorn most of the walls at our university. A white student in the class asked, "Why does it always have to be about race?" My co-facilitator didn't know how to respond, knew that race is a fraught subject in prison. She said something benign and later communicated to me that she felt as though she'd stuck her foot in her mouth. I shared some of my more memorable foot and mouth moments while teaching in prison, but we didn't try to solve the question of what her best response would have been. We came to the uneasy realization that there was no best way to respond, that these conversations need to happen, but we're still trying to figure out how best to facilitate them. After all, if we don't talk about these imbalances, if we don't talk about how race works in prison, we can pretend these inequalities don't exist, that they don't matter, when they absolutely do. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes. If anyone, you can't, there's no questions you can ask of the last presentation because our presenter is not live here in the audience, but the other 3 presenters are still on. So if you have a question you'd like to ask live, I'll wait for a hand raise. there's a lot of great stuff going on in the chat. It's one of the I think the benefits of the virtual conferences. There's been a lot of affirmations and connection in the chat. Okay, so I'm not hearing anything. So Ted, I'm going to play the Knox County Stomp that you gave me the link to, and it's like 3 minutes or so, which will take us to the end of the session. Do you want to set it up for us?
Well, sure. And I had made the connection between the Tennessee chocolate drops and the Carolina chocolate drops that most folks today know well about as a popular contemporary group. Well, this was a recording that inspired them and many, many others over the years. It's an example of African-American string band music. So Howard Armstrong, the kind of the leader of the group, and it was quite a talented trio, so I'll just throw that in. But Howard Armstrong, often talked about playing music with people of every ethnicity and background. He was conversant in what was at the time in the 20s called hillbilly music. He knew country music. He knew blues. He knew every imaginable kind of music. He knew ethnic music, having lived in an area with multiple ethnicities affiliated with the coal industry in Tennessee. So it's simply a very fluid string band performance. And you hear Howard Armstrong on the fiddle, and then Roland Armstrong on the guitar, and Carl Martin, who's generally thought of as a guitarist, on the bass. And Dom Flemons of the Carolina Chocolate Drops recently covered this performance to pay homage to it. So on a very recent release, Dom Flemons covered Knox County Stomp, and this inspired the title of our box set.
Great. All right, so I'm going to play it out. Everybody, thank you for coming and joining us this morning. The next session starts at 10:30. I want to ask everybody to make sure you visit the online posters in the exhibit hall and check out our sponsors. So have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the conference.